The crack of a rifle split the morning air, a sound sharper and more final than the blacksmith's hammer that usually punctuated the rhythm of Cooper's Crossing. Dust and glass erupted from the bank window, showering the boardwalk in glittering shards. From his vantage point in the sheriff's office, Mason Reed saw the townsfolk scatter like quail, their morning errands forgotten in a panicked scramble for cover. He set down his half-empty coffee mug, the dark liquid sloshing over the rim. Another robbery. The third in as many months since the railroad surveyors had brought easy money and the hard men who followed it. Sheriff Franklin Walsh, a man whose weary posture suggested he'd seen too many mornings like this, grabbed a repeating rifle from the wall rack. "Stay here, Mason," he ordered, his voice tight. "You're a deputy, not a gunslinger. Cover the back alley." Mason nodded, his face an impassive mask, but his hand was already on the worn grip of his Colt Peacemaker. He had taken the deputy's star 3 months ago, a reluctant concession to Walsh's persistent requests for help, and a grudging admission that even a man trying to outrun his own shadow needed a reason to get up in the morning. He moved not to the back, but to the front door, his movements economical and practiced. He was no longer the boy who had served as an army interpreter, nor the haunted recluse who had spent a decade trying to disappear. He was simply a man with a job to do. He eased the office door open a crack, and the scent of cordite already sharp on the dry air. 4 men, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, were backing out of the bank canvas bags slung over their shoulders. One of them, younger than the others by the look of his frayed clothes and nervous energy, nearly tripped on the steps. "Move it, kid," the leader snarled, shoving the younger man forward. Walsh fired a warning shot from the cover of the general store across the street. The bullet whined off the bank's signpost, sending a splinter of wood flying. The robbers returned fire, a chaotic volley that chewed up the building facades and sent panicked horses rearing at their hitching posts. Mason took his chance. He stepped out onto the boardwalk, his revolver steady in his hand. He wasn't aiming for the hardened leader or the 2 brutish figures covering their retreat. He focused on the kid, the weak link. "Drop it, son." Mason's voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. "It's not worth your life." The young robber spun toward him, his eyes wide with fear above his bandana. He raised his pistol, its barrel wavering. For a heart-stopping second, Mason saw a boy playing at being a man caught in a current too strong for him to swim against. Mason fired, not at the boy's chest, but at the ground, just in front of his boots. The bullet kicked up a spray of dirt and gravel, the sound, a sharp slap of reality. The kid flinched, his own shot going wide, and stumbled backward. The loot bag he was carrying slipped from his grasp, spilling its contents across the dusty planks of the boardwalk. Gold coins rolled into the cracks, and a cascade of jewelry glittered in the harsh Arizona sun. Among the scattered treasures, one object caught Mason's eye, a glint of silver that stopped his breath. It was a small, oval locket tarnished with age, but intricately engraved with the image of a desert primrose. He would know it anywhere. It was Sarah's. The world seemed to fall away, the gunshots fading into a dull roar. He saw not the chaotic street of Cooper's Crossing, but a sun-drenched patch of earth 14 years in the past. He saw Sarah, her blonde hair catching the light, her hands gentle as she tended her small garden behind their cabin near the fort. He had given her that locket on their first anniversary, its primrose design, a tribute to her ability to make beauty grow in the harshest of soils. And he saw the aftermath of the first Apache raid, the one that had erupted in the wake of the fraudulent treaty, the smoke, the silence, the locket lying in the dust beside her still form. The Apache hadn't taken it. He had buried her with it, clasped in her hand, a final token of a love, cut short by a war he had helped to start. A bullet splintered the doorframe beside his head, snapping him back to the present. The robbers were making a break for their horses. The young man, leaving the spilled loot behind, scrambled after them. Mason raised his revolver, his sights finding the fleeing figure, but he couldn't pull the trigger. He lowered the gun, his gaze fixed on the locket. Walsh ran up beside him, rifle at the ready. "They're getting away, Mason. What are you doing?" Mason didn't answer. He knelt, his fingers closing around the cool silver. He thumbed the clasp and it sprang open. Inside on one side was the tiny faded portrait of a young Mason, his face full of a foolish optimism he no longer recognized. On the other was a matching portrait of Sarah, her smile as bright and hopeful as he remembered. It was exactly as he had left it. How could his wife's most precious possession, buried with her 14 years ago, end up in a bank vault in Cooper's Crossing, only to be spilled at his feet by a frightened boy? It felt less like a coincidence and more like a reckoning. A ghost from his past, unearthed and demanding his attention. The pounding in his chest was not from the gunfight, but from the sudden chilling certainty that the past he had worked so hard to bury was no longer content to stay dead. Dust devils danced on the horizon, swirling columns of earth, reaching for a sky that offered no relief. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the valley, where Cooper's Crossing simmered under the relentless sun. The promises of prosperity brought by the coming railroad felt as distant and ephemeral as the clouds that refused to form. The town was a creature of contradictions. A single wide main street, lined with raw new lumber storefronts standing shoulder to shoulder with weathered adobe buildings that had crouched here for decades. It was a place on a knife's edge, caught between a future of iron and steam and a past of blood and dust. Mason Reed's ranch sat apart from it all, a solitary outpost on the lip of the valley, the last vestige of one world before the land gave way to another. From his porch, he could see the town below, a collection of human ambition and folly. And to the east, the vast, unforgiving expanse that had once been undisputed Apache territory. Most folks thought him a fool for living so close to the boundary, a man tempting fate. They were half right. He wasn't tempting fate. He was serving a self-imposed penance. His house was as Spartan as a monk's cell. The floors were swept bare, the furniture functional and unadorned. There were no curtains on the windows, no decorations on the walls. The only personal item was a small framed photograph on the nightstand beside his bed. It was of Sarah, taken the year they were married. Her face was captured in a moment of laughter, her eyes alight with a fierce, joyful spirit that Mason had tried and failed to forget for 14 years. It was the only ghost he allowed himself. In the days following the bank robbery, Mason found himself locked in a ritual that spoke to both his past as a soldier and his present unease. He would sit at his small kitchen table in the evenings, the silver locket beside him, and meticulously clean his guns. The rhythmic click and slide of metal on metal was a familiar comfort, a language of precision and order, in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. He would disassemble the Colt, its parts laid out on an oilcloth, with surgical care, each piece wiped, oiled, and reassembled with a muscle memory that transcended thought. He did the same with his Winchester, its long barrel gleaming in the lamplight. It was a meditation, a way to keep his hands busy, while his mind grappled with the impossible question of the locket. He had asked Sheriff Walsh about it, of course. The jewelry had been in a safe deposit box belonging to a recently deceased prospector, a man who had kept to himself and left no family. There was no record of how he had come by the locket. The trail was cold before it even began. Yet Mason knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that its appearance was no accident. It was a sign, a splinter of the past working its way to the surface. He felt like a man standing on a frozen lake, hearing the first cracks spreading beneath his feet. He was watching one such evening, the sky turning from azure to bruised purple, as storm clouds gathered on the western horizon when he saw it. A figure stumbling along his fence line, swaying like a wounded animal. The storm was coming fast, the wind rising and carrying the rare, sweet scent of rain. Thunder muttered in the distance, a low growl of discontent. Through the thickening curtain of rain, Mason made out a woman's form, her dark hair plastered against copper skin, her clothes torn and stained with what could only be blood. She staggered 3 more steps before collapsing just beyond his gate. He hesitated, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. Strangers meant trouble, especially those who arrived half dead. But something in the woman's proud, resilient silhouette pushed him forward, overriding the caution that had become his second nature. He crossed the yard, the first fat raindrop striking the hard-packed earth around him, and when he reached her, his breath caught in his throat. Even through the mud and blood, he recognized her. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that, when they opened, he knew would hold the same fierce intelligence he remembered from her childhood. Kiona, he whispered the name, emerging unbidden from a place of buried memory. She was the daughter of Chief Nakohi, a girl of 12 the last time he had seen her watching from the edge of the circle, as he spoke the words that had betrayed her people. Blood seeped from a wound in her side. Taking her in meant inviting a different kind of storm to his door, one far more dangerous than the tempest gathering in the sky. Yet, as lightning split the clouds and thunder cracked overhead, Mason knew he had no choice. He gathered Kiona into his arms, surprised at how light she felt, and carried her toward the house. He was done running from the consequences of his past. It seemed the past had finally come to find him. In the amber lamplight, Kiona's injuries revealed themselves fully. A deep gash along her ribs had been poorly bound with a strip of cloth now saturated with blood and rainwater. Her face was gaunt, the elegant cheekbones sharper than he remembered, telling a story of hunger and hard travel. Mason worked efficiently, cutting away the blood-soaked fabric, cleaning the wound with whiskey that made her body tense even in unconsciousness. The gash was deep but clean, a knife wound, not a bullet. As he threaded a needle to close the worst of it, he paused. This act was a threshold. Once crossed, there would be no turning back. When she finally awoke, the storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and cool. She did not stir at first, her breathing remaining steady, as she assessed her surroundings through slitted eyes. An Apache did not survive by rushing blindly into the unknown. A small cabin, the scent of coffee and leather, and the man sitting vigil nearby, older, now weathered, but unmistakably the young interpreter from her past. Her eyelids fluttered open, meeting his gray eyes without surprise. Recognition dawned, followed by a weariness that was entirely genuine. After accepting a cup of water, she spoke, her voice rough but clear, each word deliberate. "The storm brought me to your door, interpreter," she said, her use of his old title a carefully aimed dart. "The spirits have a strange sense of humor." "Spirits had nothing to do with it," Mason replied, his tone clipped. "Who's after you?" "The same man whose words you once spoke." Kiona's gaze was unflinching. "Colonel Blackwood." The name struck Mason like a physical blow. Henry Blackwood, the architect of the treaty, the man whose ambition had been the forge for Mason's shame. Blackwood retired from the army years ago. "What would he want with you?" "He works for the railroad now," she explained, pushing herself up slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at her stitches. "And he wants what I carry." With effort, she reached for a small leather pouch tied at her waist. From it, she withdrew a folded piece of parchment, its edges worn soft with handling. She handed it to him. Mason unfolded it carefully. His breath caught as he recognized the document. It was a fragment of the original treaty, the section detailing the boundary lines. And there in the margin, in Blackwood's precise, damning script, was a penciled note read to translate as per verbal directive. It was the proof. The undeniable physical proof of the lie he had been forced to tell. My father kept it hidden until his death, Kiona said, her voice a low thrum of conviction. He always believed the words would matter someday. He told me if justice was ever to be found, I had to find you. The only white man who showed shame for what was done. The weight of the parchment in his hand was immense. It was not just paper and ink. It was 14 years of bloodshed, starvation, and broken lives. It was the ghost of her brother lost in the fighting. It was the ghost of his wife Sarah lost to the retaliatory violence that followed. It was the sum of all their sorrows. They are looking for me. Kiona stated not as a question, but as a fact. Government agents came to our camp. They killed 3 of my people searching for this. She touched the document. Blackwood will not stop until he has it back, and I am silenced. Mason stared at the damning evidence, his own past staring back at him. To help her was to declare war on a powerful man and the railroad interests he represented. It was to invite the destruction of the solitary peace he had so carefully constructed. To refuse was to be the coward he had been 14 years ago. He is a man who buries his mistakes. Interpreter Kiona's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and knowing. Are you? The sound of hooves pulled Mason from his troubled thoughts 2 days later. He had kept Kiona hidden her wound, slowly beginning to heal, a fragile truce forming between them in the shared silence of the isolated ranch. He stepped onto the porch as 4 riders crested the rise, their forms dark against the morning sun. Sheriff Walsh was in the lead, but it was the man beside him who made Mason's blood run cold. Colonel Henry Blackwood sat his horse with the same ramrod straight posture. Mason remembered a man who commanded space just by occupying it. Silver had replaced the auburn in his hair, but his eyes were the same cold blue and missing nothing. He was flanked by 2 men in city suits who radiated an air of impatient authority. Reed Blackwood's voice was as sharp and clipped as ever, a sound that transported Mason back 2 decades. A surprise to find you here. I'd heard you'd simply evaporated. I like my privacy, Colonel Mason said, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. We're searching for an Apache fugitive, one of the suited men, a portly fellow named Hollister announced. She wounded a federal agent. We have authority to search all properties in this area. Blackwood's gaze swept over Mason, a thin, contemptuous smile playing on his lips. He dismounted, his movements precise. Let's not stand on ceremony, Reed. You always had a misplaced sympathy for the natives. A weakness you inherited from your father, as I recall. He walked onto the porch, his presence a violation. And your wife Sarah, wasn't it? Such a tragedy. Killed in the very raids that erupted from that unfortunate misunderstanding. If only you'd had the fortitude to see the bigger picture, perhaps she'd still be with you. The words were a deliberate, cruel probing of an old wound. Blackwood wasn't just searching for Kiona. He was enjoying this, relishing the opportunity to torment the man he saw as a weak-willed traitor. My wife is none of your business. Mason said, his voice dangerously low. Everything is my business when it concerns the security of this territory and the progress of the railroad, Blackwood countered smoothly. He pushed past Mason into the small house. Sheriff, you and your men check the barn. Mr. Hollister, you take the grounds. I'll have a look in here. Mason followed him inside, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The house was clean, tidy, nothing out of place. But he knew it wasn't enough. Blackwood's eyes missed nothing. The colonel ran a hand over the spare bed where Kiona had rested. He picked up the photograph of Sarah from the nightstand. A beautiful woman. A pity her husband's conscience was so inconvenient. He moved into the kitchen, his gaze sweeping the room. He circled the table that Mason had placed over the trap door to the root cellar. His boots scuffed against the edge of the small rug covering it. He paused. For a heart-stopping moment, Mason was sure he knew. But then Blackwood's eyes fixed on something else. Something on the floorboards near the stove. He knelt, his movements slow and deliberate. "Interesting," he murmured. He looked up directly at Mason, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. He pointed a gloved finger at the floor. "It seems you've had a visitor. A clumsy one." Mason's gaze followed his finger. A few dried, dark brown drops marred the wood. Blood. Kiona's blood from when he had first tended her wound. It was a minuscule detail, one that anyone else would have overlooked. But Blackwood was not anyone else. The game was over. "She's here," Blackwood stated, rising to his feet. Before Mason could react, before he could draw his weapon or formulate a denial, a shout came from outside. "Colonel, we found tracks down by the wash." Blackwood's smile widened. He gave Mason a look of pure contempt. "Your sentimentality will be your undoing, Reed. It always has been." He turned and strode out of the house. Mason didn't hesitate. He lunged for the kitchen table, shoving it aside. He tore up the rug and threw open the trap door. "Kiona now." She was already on the ladder, her face pale but her eyes blazing. He pulled her up just as the shouts grew closer. "They know," he said, his voice urgent. "The back way run for the foothills." They scrambled out the back door, bullets suddenly kicking up dust at their feet. The posse was circling the house. Shouts echoed behind them. It wasn't a run. It was a desperate, chaotic flight. Mason fired back over his shoulder, not aiming to kill, but to slow them, to buy seconds. He pushed Kiona ahead toward the jagged line of hills that offered their only hope of escape. The roar of Blackwood's voice pursued them, a promise of vengeance carried on the hot, dry wind. "You can't run from me, Reed. I will hunt you to the ends of the earth." The flight into the foothills was a brutal, lung-searing ordeal. They scrambled over loose scree and through thorny chaparral that tore at their clothes and skin. For 2 days they moved, hiding by day in the scant shade of rock outcroppings, and traveling by night with the distant baying of hounds, a constant, unnerving reminder of Blackwood's relentless pursuit. During those harrowing days, a new kind of understanding formed between them. It was a bond forged not in words, but in the shared sip of water. From a single canteen, in the silent gesture of Mason helping Kiona over a treacherous ledge, in the way she would find edible roots he would have missed. They were no longer just the interpreter and the chief's daughter, trapped by a shared history. They were two people fighting for survival, their pasts eclipsed by the immediacy of the present. On the third night, they found sanctuary in a shallow cave overlooking a dry canyon. Kiona's wound, reopened during their escape, was inflamed and feverish. As Mason cleaned it as best he could, his thoughts churned. Blackwood's obsession felt too personal, too venomous to be just about a treaty and railroad right-of-way. The taunts about Sarah, about his father, they were the jabs of a man nursing a deep and private grievance. "Why does he hate you so much?" Kiona asked, her voice raspy with fever. "It is more than the treaty. I see it in his eyes." "I don't know," Mason admitted. "He always saw me as a disappointment, a man who lacked the fortitude for hard decisions." He remembered the day he resigned his commission. Blackwood had looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust, as if Mason were a flawed tool being discarded. They needed help. Their only hope lay in Cooper's Crossing with the one man who might understand the full depth of Blackwood's deception, Reverend Harwood. They made their way back under the cover of darkness, skirting the main roads. and arriving at the edge of town near dawn, Mason left Kiona hidden in a thicket by the creek and slipped into the quiet streets, making for the small white church. He found Harwood tending the roses in the church garden, his weathered face creased with worry. "Mason, thank God. They're tearing the territory apart looking for you." "I need to know about Blackwood," Mason said, getting straight to the point. "There's something more to this. Something personal." The Reverend's kindly eyes grew shadowed. He led Mason into the cool, silent sanctuary of the church. "There is," he confirmed, his voice low, "something I have kept in my confidence for many years, perhaps wrongly." He sighed, the sound heavy in the morning stillness. "You remember the Apache raids that followed the treaty, the first ones?" Mason nodded, the memory a scar on his soul. "Sarah?" "Yes," Harwood said gently. "But there were other casualties at the fort. An officer's wife and their young son. They were caught away from the main garrison when the warriors attacked." A cold dread began to seep into Mason's bones. He remembered flashes: a woman with kind eyes who organized socials at the fort, a small boy with bright red hair who would chase lizards in the dust. He had never connected them, had been too lost in his own grief. "Whose family?" Mason asked, though he already knew the answer. "Colonel Blackwood's," the Reverend said softly. "His wife Eleanor and his son Thomas. They died in the very first retaliatory strike. The one that happened because Nakohe's people realized the treaty was a lie. The pieces fell into place with the sickening finality of a coffin lid closing. It wasn't about land. It wasn't about career. It was about vengeance. Blackwood wasn't just protecting his reputation. He was a man hollowed out by grief, a man who had lost everything. And he blamed two parties for his loss: the Apache, who had killed his family, and Mason, the interpreter, whose moral failure and misplaced sympathy, he believed, had set the entire tragedy in motion. By refusing to be the ruthless tool Blackwood needed, Mason had, in the colonel's twisted logic, signed his family's death warrant. "My God," Mason whispered, sinking onto a pew. The weight of the revelation was crushing. "He sees you as the catalyst for his personal apocalypse." Harwood continued. "And Kiona as the living symbol of the people who carried it out. In his mind, destroying you both is not a crime. It is a form of justice, a balancing of the scales." Mason now understood the true nature of the monster hunting them. They were not just fugitives. They were the focus of a 14-year-old obsession, the targets of a grief so profound it had curdled into a genocidal rage. He returned to Kiona as the sun climbed higher, the truth a bitter stone in his gut. He found her by the creek, her fever higher, her face flushed. He sat beside her on the cool earth and told her everything. "This isn't about land anymore, Kiona," he said, his voice raw. "It's not just about the treaty. Blackwood's family, his wife and son, they died in the first raids, the ones that happened because of the lie I told." Kiona listened, her dark eyes searching his face. The revelation seemed to hang in the air between them, shimmering like the heat off the desert floor. It changed everything. "He blames me." Mason confessed, the words tearing from him. "He thinks my weakness, my conscience, is what cost him his family. And he blames your people for taking them. He doesn't want the treaty fragment buried. He wants us buried. He wants to wipe the slate clean, and he thinks our blood is the only thing that will do it." The confession transformed the conflict. It was no longer a political struggle for justice. It was a deeply personal war between three broken people, all shaped by the same originating tragedy. Mason realized with sickening clarity that he was not just atoning for his part in a fraudulent treaty, but for his indirect role in the deaths that had created the very monster now hunting them. For the first time, Kiona looked at her enemy not as a faceless villain, a symbol of oppression, but as a man twisted into a mirror image of her own grief. He too had lost family to the endless spiraling cycle of violence. A flicker of something not sympathy, but a profound sorrowful understanding passed through her eyes. "So we are all ghosts to him," she whispered, "reminders of what he lost." "Yes," Mason said, "and he won't stop until he has exorcised us for good." The stakes were no longer just about land or law. They were about survival and about breaking a cycle of revenge that threatened to consume them all. The hunt was no longer a chase. It had become a blood feud. With Blackwood's motivation laid bare, their situation grew infinitely more perilous. He wasn't just a man enforcing the railroad's will. He was a predator on a personal quest. Using the railroad's vast resources and the authority of his past rank, he effectively locked down Cooper's Crossing. Men with rifles, railroad security, not deputies, patrolled the streets, their eyes hard and watchful. The town had become a trap. Reverend Harwood arranged for them to hide in the cellar of a sympathetic parishioner, Eleanora Miller, a widow whose house backed onto the creek. It was a temporary reprieve, but Mason knew they couldn't stay. Blackwood would search house by house until he found them. Their only chance was to get out of town to reach a federal marshal in the next county, whom Harwood believed was investigating the railroad's land dealings. Their escape was a frantic, desperate dash through the town's labyrinthine back alleys as night fell. They moved from shadow to shadow, the sounds of the patrols a constant menacing presence. They were making for the livery stable at the far end of town, where Harwood had arranged for horses to be left for them. They were halfway there, slipping through the narrow gap between the blacksmith shop and the assayer's office, when a lantern flared ahead of them, blocking their path. Two railroad guards stood silhouetted against the light. "Hold it right there." Mason shoved Kiona back into the shadows and drew his Colt. A shootout in the confined alley was suicide. Before he could make a decision, a new voice cut through the tension. "Stand down, boys. They're with me." Sheriff Walsh stepped out of the darkness, his own gun drawn, but pointed at the ground. The guards looked at him confused. Sheriff Colonel Blackwood's orders were. "I'm aware of the Colonel's orders," Walsh cut in his voice, weary but firm. "I'm also aware that he's turned this town into an armed camp terrorizing citizens in pursuit of a personal vendetta. That ends tonight. My authority still means something here." His gaze met Mason's. For weeks, Mason had seen the conflict in the sheriff's eyes, a man caught between his duty, his pragmatism, and a conscience he tried to ignore. It seemed that Blackwood's escalating brutality had finally pushed him to a breaking point. "The livery," Walsh said, his voice low. "Go. I'll handle this." He turned to face the guards, creating a momentary diversion. Mason and Kiona didn't wait. They sprinted down the alley, the sounds of a heated argument fading behind them. They burst into the livery stable, the familiar scent of hay and horse, a strange comfort in the chaos. But their relief was short-lived. The stable doors at the far end crashed open, and Colonel Blackwood stood there, a lantern held high in one hand, a revolver in the other. His face was a mask of cold fury. "Did you really think it would be that easy, Reed?" he snarled. "Did you think that ineffectual, spineless sheriff could stop me?" He took a step into the stable, a predator cornering his prey. "This ends now. Here, where no one can interfere." He raised his revolver, the dark bore a final, unblinking eye. Just as he was about to fire, the side door of the stable flew open. Sheriff Walsh stood there, his own gun now leveled at Blackwood. "I said that's enough, Colonel." Walsh's voice was rock steady. The betrayal in Blackwood's eyes was livid. He spun toward the sheriff, and in that split second, Mason acted. He shoved Kiona toward the waiting horses and threw himself behind a stack of hay bales as the stable erupted in a deafening roar of gunfire. The boundary marker stood like a weathered tombstone on the desolate plain, a lonely testament to a broken promise. An approaching dust storm bled across the horizon, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise and charging the air with a tense electric hum. It was here at the epicenter of their shared history that the final confrontation would happen. Blackwood and his remaining railroad guards had cornered them against a rocky mesa. With them was a wounded but resolute Sheriff Walsh, his allegiance now irrevocably chosen. Just as it seemed they were outmatched figures appeared on the ridge behind them. Kiona's Apache kinsmen, summoned by a message sent by Reverend Harwood, arriving like spirits of the land to bear witness. The odds were evened, but Blackwood was beyond caring. He advanced on foot, the rising wind whipping at his coat, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. This was no longer about witnesses or evidence. It was his Gethsemane. 14 years, Reed, he roared over the wind, his voice a raw torrent of grief. 14 years I have carried the image of my wife and son in my mind, murdered by savages you were too weak to condemn. He gestured wildly at Kiona and her kinsmen. And you, his voice dripped with venom, you and your conscience took them from me. You lit the match. Reed and my family burned. The shootout began, a chaotic explosion of sound and fury against the backdrop of the howling wind. Dust swirled, reducing visibility, turning the battlefield into a confusing melee of fleeting targets and indistinct shadows. During a lull in the fighting, as men reloaded behind cover, Sheriff Walsh, clutching a wound in his shoulder, stumbled toward Kiona. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a pain that went deeper than his injury. It was me, he gasped, the words torn from him by the wind. Your brother, Takakota, at the hunting grounds all those years ago. Kiona stared at him, her expression unreadable. I was just a boy. Walsh choked out the confession, a poison he had held for a lifetime. Scared. He wouldn't move. He just stood there, so defiant. I didn't mean to. I've carried that shot every day since. This was the core of it all. Not just Blackwood's grief, but Walsh's guilt, Mason's shame, Kiona's loss, all tangled together in a knot of violence that had its roots in a single, deliberate lie. In the heart of the storm, this moment of terrible truth became the eye. The fighting resumed, but its nature had changed. It was no longer a battle over land, but an exorcism of ghosts. The final confrontation came down to two men, isolated by the swirling dust, Mason and Blackwood. They met in the open, their revolvers empty, their faces caked with grime. It was not just a fist fight. It was a clash of ideologies. Blackwood's fists rained down with the fury of a man seeking to beat the world into submission, to punish it for his pain. Mason fought back not with rage, but with a grim, sorrowful determination, then the force of a man seeking not to win, but to end the cycle. He was fighting for redemption, while Blackwood was fighting for the oblivion of revenge. Mason, younger and driven by a clearer purpose, finally gained the upper hand. He pinned a battered and breathless Blackwood to the ground just as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, turning the dust to mud. It's over, Colonel Mason said, his voice ragged. Blackwood stared up at him, his eyes devoid of hatred, filled only with a vast, empty despair. She had red hair, he whispered, his voice cracking. My boy, just like his mother. At that moment, a figure emerged from the dust storm, a tall man with a silver-streaked beard and the unmistakable authority of a federal marshal. The cavalry had finally arrived. As the storm broke, washing the land clean, the marshal stepped forward, his badge gleaming in the sudden rain-freshened light. The fight for the boundary was over. The fight for justice was about to begin. In the calm after the storm, the world seemed newly made. The rain had washed the dust from the air, and the scent of wet sage rose from the earth, a clean, sharp perfume. Federal Marshal Porter, a man whose quiet gravitas commanded respect, took charge with swift efficiency. The treaty fragment, no longer a fugitive secret, but official evidence, was secured. Blackwood's railroad guards, sullen and defeated, were disarmed and placed under arrest. Colonel Blackwood himself was a broken man. He offered no resistance as the marshal's men took him into custody. His grief-fueled rage extinguished, leaving only the hollowed-out shell of a man behind. Kiona approached Sheriff Walsh, who sat slumped against a rock, his face etched with pain and relief. She knelt before him, looking not at the man who had been her enemy, but at the guilt-ridden boy he had confessed to being. She said nothing but placed a hand gently on his uninjured shoulder. It was not forgiveness that was a gift too easily given for a pain so deeply felt, but it was a solemn, silent understanding. It was closure. For both of them, a chapter of a long and bitter story had finally come to an end. Mason's actions, his stand against Blackwood, and his willingness to face his own past had earned him something he had long believed he'd lost forever: respect. He saw it in the nod from one of Kiona's kinsmen. He saw it in the way Marshal Porter listened to his account of the events, not as a confession from a traitor, but as testimony from a witness. He had walked through the fire of his past and emerged on the other side, not unsinged, but whole. The immediate aftermath was a quiet affair of tying up loose ends, a necessary coda to the violent climax. The stage was set for the legal battles to come. But here, on the land itself, a different kind of verdict had already been rendered. Months later, a different season had settled over the territory. The legal challenge to the fraudulent treaty was proceeding in the federal courts, a slow grinding process, but one moving inexorably toward truth. Kiona, no longer a fugitive, but a powerful advocate for her people, had testified before commissions, her quiet dignity and irrefutable evidence reshaping the narrative of the territory's history. The Southwestern Railroad Company, facing federal investigation and public scandal, had been forced to halt its expansion and enter into new fare negotiations for its route. In Cooper's Crossing, a measure of peace had returned. Sheriff Walsh, having recovered from his wound, served his office with a newfound sense of integrity, his quiet authority now rooted in something deeper than a paid-off pragmatism. Mason was no longer a recluse. He still lived on his solitary ranch, but he was no longer hiding from the world. He had found his purpose not in isolation, but in engagement in the slow, difficult work of mending what had been broken. The final scene of his long atonement took place at the small, dusty plot of land where Sarah was buried. The simple wooden cross he had carved years ago had weathered, but it stood firm. In his hand, he held the silver locket. It had been returned to him by the marshal, a personal effect in a case now closed. He knelt and gently placed it on the small mound of earth at the base of the cross. He was not saying goodbye. He was showing her that he had finally honored her memory, not by forgetting, but by becoming the man of conscience she had always believed him to be. He stood a weight he had carried for 14 years, finally lifted from his shoulders. As he turned to leave, he saw a figure waiting for him at the edge of the small cemetery, a young Apache boy, no older than 10. The boy approached him without fear, holding out a small, intricately beaded pouch. "From Kiona," the boy said in careful English. "She said to tell you the river finds its new path." Mason took the pouch. Inside was a single perfect eagle feather, a symbol of courage, wisdom, and a bond forged in conflict and truth. He looked from the feather to the horizon, where the distant mesas stood sharp against the blue sky. His path was not one of solitude after all, but one of building bridges between two worlds. He had found redemption not in erasing the past, but in rectifying it, one painful, honest step at a time.